The October Revolution is an extremely important event in world history. It was the first successful workers' revolution. But how did it all happen? In this video, I will give you a brief overview of the complicated history of the October Revolution. The Russian Empire was a totalitarian police state, ruled by an absolute monarchy. The country was very backward economically and culturally. Average life expectancy in Russia was about 35 years. Only about 20% of the population knew how to read. The workers and peasants lived horrible lives, without the 8-hour working day, minimum wage laws, or basic work safety regulations. There were many large strikes and protests, but it was not uncommon that the police would shoot at the demonstrators and kill the strikers. Despite how big the country was, there was a constant shortage of farmland and also constant famine. This is because most land belonged to the wealthy landlords and rich peasants, and because of technological backwardness, only the softest and most fertile soil could be used, and this severely limited the amount of available farmland. In 1898, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is created. Among its founders are people like Vladimir Lenin and Julius Martov. This was a Marxist party that wanted to overthrow the monarchy and bring about socialism. However, during the course of the struggle, there's a lot of disagreement about when this goal is to be implemented and how. In 1903, there emerges a split in the party. Two factions emerge: the Mensheviks, led by Martov, and the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. During the years, although Lenin and many others first anticipated that the two groups could merge again, the split ends up worsening, and the two factions become separate parties: the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Mensheviks and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Bolsheviks. The main differences between the two groups were the following. The Bolsheviks wanted an organizationally united party of serious revolutionaries, while the Mensheviks wanted a more loose, reformist-type party. Both parties agreed that the next course of action was to overthrow the monarchy and carry out the so-called bourgeois democratic revolution. This would make Russia a capitalist parliamentary democracy. However, the Mensheviks argued that the class to lead the revolution was the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. The bourgeois class served this function in the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks disagreed. They thought the capitalists couldn't be trusted to carry out the democratic revolution. In Russia, the capitalists were weaker than in France. They allied with the monarchy and feared the workers and peasants. In fact, the Bolshevik leader Lenin argued that the Russian proletariat was much stronger and more developed than the French proletariat of the late 1700s, and therefore should lead the democratic revolution and not merely support it. Lastly, the Mensheviks didn't think Russia was ready for socialism. In their opinion, the workers could never take power in Russia until after a long time of capitalist and parliamentary development. Even though the debate about the workers' revolution and socialism would only come about later, this attitude relates to the Menshevik position that workers shouldn't lead the democratic revolution, but only support the capitalist class against the monarchy. In 1905, there is an attempt at the democratic revolution. There are massive protests all over the country, mutinies in the army, and the people organize public meetings called Soviets, or councils, which get together and discuss what to do. The revolution eventually fails. It won some democratic liberties from the Tsar, but those liberties would be constantly under attack by the monarchy afterwards. This revolution is seen as a dress rehearsal for the later revolution. In 1914, World War I begins, and launches Russia into chaos. The economy is ruined by the war. There is a shortage of food, and large amounts of the population are drafted to fight in the war, mostly workers and peasants. The war is seen by many people, especially the socialists, as an unjust imperialist conquest, where millions of poor and working-class people from different countries had to die for the profits and wealth of the capitalist and monarchist governments of their countries. The attitude towards the war ends up splitting the international socialist movement, however, the so-called Second International. Many parties initially opposed the war, but then chose to support their own governments in it once the war started, in order to protect their country from the other imperialist powers. Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and other revolutionaries saw this as horrible treachery. Surely, if everyone only supports their own imperialist governments in an imperialist war, then it doesn't do anything to stop the war. In fact, it only renders support for the war. They called for turning the imperialist war into a class war, friendship between the workers of the various countries, and unity against the capitalist governments of all the warring countries. The debate between these two political lines led to the splitting of the Second International. In February 1917, the Tsar abdicates and the Russian monarchy is overthrown. This leads to the creation of the Russian Provisional Government, consisting of the capitalist Cadet Party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, better known as the SR, and the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks initially gave so-called conditional support for the Provisional Government, meaning that they supported it to the degree that it carried out the democratic reforms and other policies demanded by the population. However, it soon became very evident that the Provisional Government was a failure. The Provisional Government refused to carry out land reform, which was necessary to prevent famine and to reduce the land shortage, because it would have meant going against the power of the landlords. The Provisional Government also refused to impose stricter regulations on trading and the economy, which would have been necessary to prevent economic disaster, because it would have meant going against the capitalists, who greatly profited from the war and the shortages. Lastly, the Provisional Government supported the war. They advocated a war to a finish, meaning war until they won. But it became very evident that Russia was losing the war. However, the Provisional Government was still committed to fulfill the treaties and agreements with their allies and therefore still chose to continue Russia's involvement in the war. Clearly, a supposedly democratic government with quite a few self-proclaimed socialists in it, such as the Provisional Government was, should not act in this way. The Bolsheviks were quick to point out that the Provisional Government acts exactly like the Tsarist government, which also sided with the landlords, also sided with the capitalists, and started the imperialist war. The Provisional Government was merely continuing the Tsarist policies. In April 1917, Vladimir Lenin returns to Russia from exile and puts forward his April Theses, a set of political proposals which call for the overthrow of the Provisional Government. The Bolsheviks put forward their slogans: "Down with the Provisional Government," "Down with the capitalist ministers," "Factories for the workers," "Land to the peasants," "End to the imperialist war," "Peace, bread and land." In June, the capital city, Petrograd, nowadays called St. Petersburg, has municipal elections. The Bolsheviks achieve a massive victory, growing from essentially nothing to one of the biggest parties. The so-called defensist bloc still gets the majority, however. This bloc consisted of the SR party and the Mensheviks. Defensism meant that they supported the war effort. The biggest loser of the election was the capitalist Cadet Party, getting only 15% of the vote and losing its power as the biggest party. On July 1st, Russia launches an offensive on the front. This is known as the Kerensky Offensive, or the July Offensive. The war was going badly and casualties were mounting for Russia. The bloodthirstiness of the imperialists and the Provisional Government were very evident. On July 3rd and 4th, there are massive demonstrations and riots of hundreds of thousands of people in Petrograd. Among the demonstrators are armed soldiers who have come from the front to demand change and revolution. The Bolsheviks urge caution and say that the demonstration should be peaceful and organized. They oppose an armed confrontation and say that they are not yet strong enough for a revolution. The workers and soldiers decide to bring weapons despite the advice of the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks still take part in the demonstration to lend support to the workers. The workers and soldiers carry Bolshevik slogans: "End the war," "Peace, bread and land." There is a government crackdown against the demonstrators. Machine guns shoot into the crowd, leaving countless dead. The Bolsheviks are now seen as a major threat by the government. A warrant is issued for Lenin's arrest, and he is forced into hiding. The Bolshevik newspaper Pravda is repressed. Their printing plant and party offices are destroyed. This period of repression is known as the July Days. The Provisional Government restores the death penalty on the front against soldiers who disobey orders. The Bolsheviks lost a lot of their forces and many of their important resources. They begin publishing their newspapers under new names to avoid censorship. Despite all their difficulties, the workers now support them more than ever. The Provisional Government is exposed as a supporter of the capitalist elite and the imperialists. The Provisional Government starts forming stronger ties with the old capitalist and monarchist parties, especially the cadets, to make up for the support they've lost among the workers. In August, there is an attempted coup against the Provisional Government, called the Kornilov Affair. Kornilov was a white general in the Russian army, who wanted to institute a military dictatorship and strong rule of law to put an end to the chaos in Russia. In other words, this would have meant complete counter-revolution, end to the demonstrations, end to democracy, end to the reforms, and end to the working class movement. The railroad workers strike and don't transport Kornilov's troops. The workers and soldiers of Petrograd form armed Red Guard units and take up the defense of Petrograd against Kornilov. Kornilov's coup ends in failure. After the overthrow of the Tsarist monarchy, formation of Soviets had begun again in all large cities, but for the time being, their leadership would be predominantly Menshevik. In September, the Bolsheviks gained the majority in the Petrograd Soviet, and soon after in the Soviets of Moscow and other large cities. The Soviets function as an unrecognized secondary government, and they already carry out many of the important functions in the cities as the Russian government is breaking down. The Soviets even organized the defense of Petrograd. As the economy is in ruins and the war effort is failing, more people turn away from the Provisional Government and turn towards the Soviets. The 6th Bolshevik Party Congress had agreed that they should carry out an armed revolution. In October, the Petrograd Soviet creates a Military Revolutionary Committee, Milrevcom. These kinds of special bodies are formed all over the country, connected with each Soviet in each city. The Menshevik and SR minorities in the Soviets oppose revolution, but the SR party splits into right and left factions. The left SR group sides with the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik soldier organization takes over the Petrograd garrison. On October 24th, the military revolutionary committees occupy the telegraph, the telephone, and other important buildings. The cruiser Aurora, which is controlled by Bolshevik sailors, fires a shot to signal the beginning of the revolution. The workers and soldiers storm the Winter Palace, where the Provisional Government resides. The same evening, there is a Congress of Soviets, where delegates from the Soviets from all over the country elect the new Russian government, a government elected by the Soviets of workers and peasants, the Soviet government. The October Revolution has taken power. This would lead to a civil war, where the capitalists tried to rescue their power, where 14 capitalist governments, including the United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, Poland, and many others, invaded Soviet Russia to destroy the Soviet government, but they failed, and the Soviet Union was created. The significance of the October Revolution cannot be overstated. It showed that a revolution by the ordinary people is possible. It showed that capitalism, in the end, is incapable of solving its internal contradictions. Even despite getting moderate leftists into the capitalist government, the policy was as imperialist, profit-driven, and anti-popular as before. The moderate leftists didn't improve capitalism, they were used by it. Only revolution stopped Russia's involvement in the World War, carried out land reform, dealt with the crisis of unregulated capitalism, provided education, housing, healthcare, and began the process of building a new economic model which would serve the needs and interests of the people, not the profits of the elites.